Happy anniversary to Ratchet Clank 2. I can't believe it's been exactly 20... Yeah, this video's been a long time coming. The year is 2002. Ratchet & Clank was just released on PS2 and enticed audiences around the globe with its engaging gameplay, inventive weaponry, and crazy universe. And while people were still experiencing the glory of walking really slowly up walls, unbeknownst to them, Insomniac Games was already working on a sequel that would go on to blow their puny little minds. Yes, Sony greenlit the sequel months before the first game was even released, and the team was already working on it while they were still finishing up the first game. So only a year later, and Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, or Locked and Loaded, or just 2 in Europe, I don't know what their problem is, burst onto the scene and knocked the ball out of the park so hard it reached escape velocity and zoomed right past the friggin' moon. The Insomniac moon. With the sequel, their main focus was taking the already solid foundations from the original and turning it up to 11, making it even bigger and better. The combat this time around is a lot more fast-paced and ushered in the classic gameplay flow that's synonymous with the Ratchet & Clank franchise today. Ratchet moves faster, he can strafe and feels more responsive to control. In return, the enemies this time around are a lot more challenging and varied too, with a bigger focus on hectic run-and-gun combat as opposed to a more methodical approach in Ratchet & Clank 1. To reflect that, Ratchet's arsenal has increased from 16 weapons to 24, 19 of them being brand new designs. That's not counting that the new Megacorp weapons can now upgrade and turn into stronger ones after repeated use, technically increasing that count to a whopping 43 unique weapons in total. That's a series record. Even Ratchet himself got some RPG-style improvements, like the ability to collect XP to increase his health and multiple wrench upgrades.
In case of emergency, break glass with wrench. Hold on. This one says, use rock to break glass to get wrench to break glass to get rock.
But there's more. Remember hoverboarding? How about joining a gang and setting the asphalt on fire in hoverbike races? Remember the jet dogfights? This time there's full-blown space combat. You can even buy ship upgrades and customize its appearance. But there's more. Giant Clank sections? Yeah, that's back, this time as giant mech fights where you can flatten an entire moon. You even get an achievement, more of a small Clank type. We got that too, this time with extra gadgetbot variants. You like door lock puzzles? Yeah, me neither, but there's 2 of them anyways. But there's more. Upgradable armor, weapon mods, arena challenges, spherical worlds, crystal hunts, challenge mode, first-person mode.
Soft drinks, hard drinks, energy drinks, breath mints.
Hey, Insomniac, are you okay? You sure it's just coffee you guys were on? This whole game just oozes creativity. There's so many unique ideas and one-off moments that just show that everyone involved tried their damnedest to blow people away. Let's just hope the crunching wasn't too bad. The game received critical acclaim and many fans still call it the best entry in the franchise to this day, including me. This game is a classic, and if you're still not convinced, I rest my case. Now, what I find interesting is a similar transformation has happened in the music department too. Our Lord and Savior David Bergeaud has been at it again, and this time he's not pulling any punches. I gotta say, as iconic as the original soundtrack is, I actually prefer the second one. Don't get me wrong, this is fantastic. But this... I might even go as far as to say this is my favorite soundtrack of the bunch, albeit followed by an uncomfortably close second. This time Bergeaud's getting a little help from a certain Niels by Nielsen, who you might nowadays know as the composer of the Hitman soundtracks. There's little known about his involvement in Ratchet & Clank, but from an interview we can deduce that he was brought on board by David to help out writing some cues.
I guess I shouldn't actually say that, should I? I did a few, I did some post-writing. But then eventually, I mean, it was such a collaboration that he was kind enough to say, let's just put him on there. Why not?
This kind of stuff isn't exactly unheard of in the soundtrack industry, but there's no way for me to tell who did what specifically, so let's just include him too whenever I say David. And yes, since David Bergeaud was also the composer for Insomniac's other title, Resistance, that means he went on a streak pumping out bangers after bangers for 7 consecutive years. Man's about to call in the attack chopper. Okay, just one last thing before we jump right into this analysis. The single most underrated improvement of this entire game.
Stereophonic sound.
Thank God! No, but for real, hats off to Insomniac for making stereo music a priority this time around. I'd say it was worth it for the intro of Bold and Silver City alone. Sequels are tricky. There's an infamously narrow path between recapturing the original magic without retreading old ground and trying something new without alienating old fans. Too similar is a lazy cash grab. Too different...
What? A thing changed? I don't like things changing!
Same goes with music, but things might be even trickier because we're dealing with subconscious emotions. Most people won't be able to explain in exact terms what has changed, but if the vibe isn't right, people will notice and complain and complain and complain. So let's recap. The first game's music was a clever fusion of orchestra, jazz, jungle and big beat. To mirror the nuts and bolts aesthetic of the universe in Ratchet Clank 1, Bergeaud went for a sampled aesthetic, reusing loops, textures and even going as far as sprinkling in some vocal shouts and DJ scratches. Throw in some heavy spy music influences and we're set. That's the elevator pitch, but in case you haven't, you might want to check out my analysis of the first Ratchet Clank soundtrack and come back to this later, since this video is technically a follow-up. With that out of the way, let's boot up the first level of Ratchet Clank 2 and see if anything's changed. Oh, okay, this is how we're doing this. Military drums, tight orchestra stabs, and this filthy synth bass. It's similar, but yeah, we've evolved alright. So surface level, let's see what we've got here. Okay, we got more of a military vibe going. That makes sense, since this time Ratchet's been trained by Megacorp and is now an actual commando and not just some mechanic. Also, we're literally infiltrating a hostile aircraft with a nuclear bomb launcher. It doesn't get more militant than that. Then we have orchestra. Sure, that's carried over directly from the original. Also, we hear just the shortest suggestion of that good old spy music we know and love. So the biggest difference might actually be in the drums. A main cornerstone of the original Ratchet & Clank soundtrack was the use of old-school jungle drum loops. While these were a cool artistic choice, they were also limiting since Bergeaud had to tailor his music to pre-recorded drums. This, to me, sounds more like a programmed MIDI drum sequence. It's kinda missing that natural variation from a real drum set. The rhythms of the original are still here though, so that original drum aesthetic isn't so much gone as it's just transformed. In many ways, this first level is a bold statement from Insomniac. This is gonna be a bigger, better sequel. Look, even the walls have moving stuff in them. The music too is giving us a taste of what's more to come. In a way, this whole level serves as an appetizer. This soundtrack is, much like the game itself, a product of self-discovery. The original Ratchet & Clank game was awesome, but it felt like it didn't fully stand on its own feet yet. I mean, Ratchet didn't even have his final voice actor.
This isn't the real Captain Quark, you numbskull.
This isn't Fizzwidget.
We had the jump and run exploration, we had the real-time shooter action, but there's one last pillar missing for that classic Ratchet & Clank experience. RPG elements. Look, nowadays they're everywhere, but back then that was a big deal. This game series just wouldn't be the same without the power creep. Like, imagine they drop a new one without the weapon upgrades. In a sense, the sequel feels more Ratchet & Clank than Ratchet & Clank. Same thing with the soundtrack. While the original wears its hip-hop and big beat inspirations on its sleeve, Ratchet & Clank 2 really took its time to finalize its own musical style. We've got the crazy harmony and the contemporary orchestral fusion, but only now Bergeaud has found his missing third pillar. But honestly, we're only getting started, so I'm afraid that third pillar will have to wait for now. It's okay, it's not all doom and gloom. So where was I? Oh yeah, right. As I've covered in my last video, an essential part of the Ratchet & Clank sound was the prominent use of tritones, undeniably one of the most dissonant intervals. But it's not alone. There's an even more sinister little sibling called the minor second. Yes, these two notes are just so uncomfortably close together that they create this timbre that almost feels like it's drilling into your ears. You can even take it an octave apart and it's still pretty dissonant. We know David's all about dissonance. Like the tritone, the minor second is your fast pass to move out of scale. Chances are pretty high that going one semitone above or below a note will see you landing in between chords and scales, what's known as chromaticism. Let's say you add a minor second to the root note, the tonic. Well, you're basically giving a middle finger to the very foundation of your song. Move a minor second away from the dominant, the fifth note, and you get either a minor sixth, which I guess is a little out there, or if you move down, you get...
You get the devil's interval!
Yes, we get our old friend, the tritone. So, in a way, nothing really changed. The first game's music was definitely no stranger to chromaticism, but it seemed like Bergeaud was especially putting a spotlight on the tritone. In the sequel, he's relaxed this focus quite a bit, but at the core there's still that same harmonic fusion of dramatic, jazzy or wacky dissonance that was so essential to the first game. This time, by embracing all kinds of dissonance, Bergeaud's put himself in an even better position to absolutely shatter music theory. More freedom than ever to experiment with weird chord progressions, polytonality and key changes, to the point where trying to answer basic questions like, is this song in a major or minor key, has got me here like...
It's not that simple.
What?
Seriously though, he'll just casually use both at the same time. He effortlessly pulls off these inexplicable moves until you look at it through the lens of dissonance and realize, well, the difference between a major chord and its parallel minor chord is just a minor second. Basically, this guy was my Jacob Collier.
Should we listen to them all one by one?
You probably didn't realize it, but I might have just given you the ultimate key to making Ratchet & Clank chord progressions. Start off with a major or minor chord, slide either the root or the fifth note up or down by a minor second, and then just use that note to make a second minor or major chord. It can be the top, the bottom, just anywhere. In this weird, dissonant landscape Bergeaud established, all these moves are valid, and that's why analyzing this music is so fascinating. You never know what to expect. He twists and distorts chords and harmonies and reassembles them in a new way that somehow still works. Things that usually sound wrong in this new context sound right. That's the magic of breaking rules. Oh, also it makes for some funky bass lines. Bro, the bass lines. Oh, and speaking of Gorn. Yes, Gorn gets its own chapter. This track is way underrated.
I just kind of left feeling a little empty and a little disappointed.
And I know it's your opinion, but your opinion's wrong.
I recently showed a friend of mine who's played the games perhaps once or twice casually the music for Gorn, and the first thing they said was, this could be some space pirate fight or something. So what immediately crossed my mind was, sure, theming. We know from the first game that Bergeaud's great at that. Remember my whole ramble about how each planet has its own sound palette, instruments, yada yada? Well, obviously for Gorn, Bergeaud used very piratey strings and spaceshipy brass and... yeah. You see where this starts falling apart. Aside from that bass line and some Ratchet and Clanky textures in the background, this track is mostly carried by your average MIDI orchestra. Even the drums are just timpanis, not a single yo-ho or anything, so how then does this fit so well? Well, that's the art of composing, and for that we must step into the wishy-washy realm of subconscious cultural and contextual associations.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination.
See, I think there's something more subtle going on here. I get that this track may not be the heaviest banger, but due to its more orchestral nature, it really highlights just how much heavy lifting the composition does. For me, it's that swing in the rhythm, along with the heavy emphasis on the downbeat, that gives this whole track this subtle, swashbuckling feel, almost mimicking how sea shanties work, without ever breaking out an accordion. That's not a jab. You can hear a similar rhythm for the Felsen system, another space battle with the thugs, so perhaps this was intentional. This one's a little less underrated, and rightfully so, like he really didn't need to go this hard for a ship minigame. As important as the synths and samples are, it's tracks like these where you realize that all that is really just the icing on top of an insanely well-composed cake. What I'm getting at is, even if we were to strip away all the instrumentation and sound design, oftentimes it's the underlying composition itself that's still enough to set the right mood. It's this ability to navigate a whole world of subconscious musical associations that enables composers to use abstract things like harmony and rhythm to paint a concrete image. And it's crazy to me how Bergeaud almost makes it look easy balancing all that with the OG's iconic but also restrictive sampled style. If we go back to Gorn, that bass line not only gives us this sequenced, loopy feel akin to Ratchet 1, in a more classical sense it's also an ostinato, a ground bass that repeats as the rest of the orchestra develops over it. It's just as much a catchy synth groove as it is a sweeping orchestral piece. There's that urgency in the accompaniment, with those frantic strings and heavy brass clashing like spaceships in the storm. Also, I just love how he decides to throw in a whole new part in the last 20 seconds. When I listen to this with my eyes closed, I can picture the whole battle unfold in front of me like a friggin' action movie. You know what? Screw it. This video is getting out of hand anyways. Almost like war drums, the timpani and droning bass set the stage as this time you bring the battle to them. You're Ratchet, trained Commando, and today it's personal. Out of nowhere, the string melody flutters in like the Star Explorer dancing nimbly between dense clouds as a storm starts to engulf the ship. Your mission is simple. Infiltrate the fleet, locate Angela, and blast the thugs to smithereens. You engage the auxiliary boosters, but suddenly your radar jams as this faint, distorted texture comes into the mix and the intensity of the melodies ramps up. From the mist, flashes of laser bolts soon past the fogged up windscreen. In a futile effort to evade the attackers, Ratchet does a barrel roll out into the open. A thunderous brass part comes in as lightning strikes and illuminates the mothership in a ghostly aura. Do you know what I mean? This isn't just loops anymore, it's an evolving orchestral movement with the engine of a Ratchet Clank track. There's plenty of moments in the first game where Bergeaud's ability to paint with sound gets to shine, but this time it's almost enigmatic, like he's finally been freed. And of course it's not just Gorn. I'm sorry, bad joke. So this section gets a little ranty, but I just needed a place to list off all these musical details I've found that really tie the soundtrack to the location or theme in this almost subtle way where I can't even tell if it's on purpose or not. It just works.
It just works. Hey, what a coincidence.
Let's take a look at Smolg.
Smolg.
Smolg? Is it Dutch? Smolg? We start off with this wispy string melody and gentle pizzicato setting us up in the clouds of Smolg's atmosphere. There's these synth plucks almost like sonar bleeps from the airships of this enormous freight operation. Then we get that brass perfectly underscoring those giant tankers fading into the bed of fog. But it's not just, yeah, brass sounds big and the ships are big, so I use the brass to symbolize the ships. No. Once again, even if you were to take away all the instrumentation, you're still stuck with the composition itself that fits. Take a closer look at that main brass melody here. Notice anything? Yeah, this is just this phrase again, but in a different key. This track is full of these repeating, transposing patterns, the key center constantly moving while Ratchet is literally treading on shifting grounds. And if you consider how low notes are traditionally associated with largeness and high notes with littleness, you could even argue that this cascade of low and high brass melodies symbolizes the entire megacorp freight operation on Smolg, from the tiny refueling platforms to the giant freight vessels. Or let's take the Microbot March with its quaint, light-footed melody. Once again the tritone is incorporated into the harmony, but this time giving the track a whimsical Lydian feel. If you remember from my first video, this is a case of a wacky tritone. It's just the perfect accompaniment to half a dozen tiny metal shoes clicking behind Clank's every step. And I don't know what it is about that harmony, but Whoopash just sounds like space. It just does. I'm sure it's only in part because the arpeggio reminds me of the spacey segue part in Star Wars. I guess all composers just agree that this chord equals space.
That's it? Oh my god,
Yeah,
that's
one more time.
That is it. Tell me that's not the perfect space sound.
Oh, and this? Pure genius.
Shirt and shoes are required when shopping at Megacorp.
Aside from the fact that this is a great example for a very different use of dissonance and chromaticism, it's also our first case of diegetic music in the series, with that speaker filter and reverb making the cheesy music sound like it's right there blaring through cheap mall speakers. I can practically smell the perfume aisle already. It's almost this series' version of the Star Wars Cantina Band, a fun in-universe excuse for the composer to ham it up, just in that case with jazz, or to be lore accurate.
Where do proto-pets come from? Why, they come from Megacorp, dear.
That's right, Mrs. Robot.
Really, I could go on and on. So I will. How about the Thug Leader mech fight? The other one, which just sounds like two giant robots coming at each other with fists with these big orchestra stabs hitting with every punch. And let's not forget about the importance of sound design. Tundor Waste sounds so eerie in part because of the use of perfect fifths in unison, giving us this ambiguous harmony. But it's twice as effective when played by a lonely pad synth. Add to it another lonely sonar bleep. That's the sound of you all alone in a freezing wasteland. And well, sometimes nothing's quite as effective at conveying the adrenaline of being chased by public transportation, like actually putting a train horn in the soundtrack. Meanwhile, for the hoverbike races, there's these cool housey chords, giving the whole thing a vibe which I can only describe as arcadey. All I know is it puts me in just the right zone where I can dissociate with the fact that I'm pushing Mach 10 speeding through some random canyon.
He did that on purpose.
Or one of the biggest outliers, Tabora's mining area with this slow meditative beat playing during a low point in the story. Lost in an alien environment, reflecting on your journey, but it's also kinda funky. This track wouldn't even work without the sound design. The synths in this alone take you places, like you will see God. We also got Jamming Array, which fittingly uses distorted, synthetic, well, jammy sounds. Wait. Okay, what's with the sonar bleeps? I mean, okay, it fits here, with all the satellites and stuff, but they're everywhere.
The one that goes beep boo boo bop boo boo beep.
No man, you're thinking of beep boo boo bop boo boo bop.
Well, speaking of weird noises, once again Bergeaud makes use of these sample CDs from the original. So we can all rest assured that that all-important sampled aesthetic is also still here.
All samples and loops that were included in Ratchet were either created from scratch or they were altered versions of sample libraries. Which ones? No idea. At some point or another, I used every single library.
Another returning practice, albeit a lot less often this time, is consistency between different tracks of the same planet. Todano's got a pretty unique identity with this gunslinger guitar. But when we enter the inner labs, we get a new track that also has a similar guitar riff. But this one instead evolves into this sneaky jam that accompanies you as you infiltrate the complex. As the action escalates, it transforms further into an epic, heroic part, empowering us to push on. We even hear that phrase from the game's intro. Clearly, Bergeaud has written this track to be one of the highlights of... What? There's a bug in the game with the song trigger and the track never plays? So that's why that part always kind of feels like a drag. So while editing this, I just noticed there's actually another unused track, an alternate arena boss theme with a different intro, but also this again. Am I uncovering a conspiracy? Finally, let's look at Siberius, this game's token snow level. Besides the other one, yes, there's 2 snow levels. The low-hanging fruit would be to simply grab some sleigh bells and chimes and call it a day, but no, all we get are these staccato strings with a twitchy beat. So why does this sound so cold? The culprit, in my opinion, is this metallic percussion sample. It's really just a weird drum loop, but Bergeaud is great at gauging the potential for these abstract sounds to enforce the theme, like giving Siberius this frostbitten, crystalline vibe. Now, keen ears among you might have noticed something strange about that loop. Let me just play both the loop and the track at the same time. What is this? It's like they're drifting apart.
Ugh. What's that, brother?
Yeah, about that. I think it's time to talk about that last pillar. If I had to name the 3 most significant qualities of a classic Bergeaud-style Ratchet Clank track, I'd have to boil it down to these. A fusion of contemporary genres and orchestral music. Unorthodox harmonies focusing on dissonance and chromaticism. But for the final thing that only now really made its way into the franchise, we have what I would call the 3rd foundational pillar of the Ratchet Clank sound. Rhythmic freedom. Well, let's talk rhythm. Most music has a tempo, a sort of pulse that all rhythms are built upon. By accenting certain beats, you start giving this pulse an overarching pattern, a time signature. Most contemporary music, and I'm talking like 90%, is written in 4/4, meaning it takes 4 beats, quarter notes here, to fill up each measure.
I'll have 2 9s, a 6 with extra dip, a 7, 2 45s.
Well, it's less common, but it definitely happens. Once you start experimenting with different time signatures, a whole new world opens up. It's kinda crazy to think about how the world of modern music is built on 4/4. Here's a fun challenge. That time signature is so common we literally call it common time. But why? First off, it just feels satisfying and even, and it's become second nature to both listeners and musicians. But another thing is, honestly, creating songs with odd time signatures is just kinda hard. Of course you could just slap 11/4 on the first page of your piece and the rest is technically just counting that each bar adds up to 11, but it's a whole different story in practice because, well, it's gotta sound good too. There's no shame in using a simple 4/4 if that's what it needs. If your song is just complex for complexity's sake, it can often feel forced. That's the crux of it, to make it sound natural and effortless. That's the mark of a true maestro. So anyways, Bergeaud casually nails this aspect multiple times in the soundtrack. Oozla, for example, feels so straightforward with those brass hits accentuating the heavy beats. It's so natural it took me a while to even notice it, but this track is written in 5/4. Drum patterns are among the biggest pitfalls when using odd time signatures. If you're using 4/4, you're good to go, just roll with the patterns you're used to. But if we turn this into an odd meter, well, what do you do with that extra beat? If we simply continue the pattern, every other measure will be out of sync. To return to our Siberius problem, that's exactly what's going on here. The original percussion loop uses a classic 4/4 time signature. Because why would you make a loop pack in a time signature that nobody ever uses? But if you count Siberius itself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. What?
That is not correct.
So while that loop is in 4/4, the song itself isn't. It's in 7/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This gives it this off-kilter rhythm as if you're slipping on ice. The video writes itself. So in order to make the two compatible, Bergeaud actually chopped up this percussion loop so that it would fit a 7/4 meter instead.
I seldom use a sample without seriously altering its original nature. Let's say the kick is on 1 and 3, I might take that kick, splice it and move it around so it has a syncopation somewhere in there. Yeah. So the raw material is always used, reused and tweaked.
One example where the uneven meter is a little more noticeable is the mineshaft on Grelbin. This track uses a 9/4 time signature. The thing is, well, couldn't you also look at this as a simple 4/4 with an extra note every second bar? There's evidence to support that argument. Listen to how in every second measure the last snare hits twice. Like it's literally just skipping at that last beat. And because it's fun, here's a version where I removed every 9th bar. Do you notice how it flows a lot smoother now? Effectively it's in 4/4 or 8/4. The technicalities can get pretty confusing, but I hope I can sort of bring my point across. On the topic of confusion, I wanted to shine the spotlight on arguably the most disorienting track in the game. Snivelak. God, I love this track. You can almost taste the mushroom spores in the noxious red smog. Of course, rhythmically, this is another weird one. Even if you know the time signature, this track keeps throwing you off. It does not welcome you. Throughout, there's these repeating patterns that lure you into a false sense of security. You latch onto them trying to make sense of the rhythm, but they only cause more confusion as they randomly drift in and out of phase. The kick drum in particular is placed in a way where you can't even tell where to start counting. In other words,
it's a trap!
In case you haven't figured it out, which I don't blame you, the track alternates between 7/4 and 5/4 every other bar, which totals up to 12/4 for the whole phrase. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
But later in the track, Bergeaud spices things up in the smartest way possible. Suddenly the mood switches to a more frantic, even feel with this breakbeat rolling along. If your gut tells you he secretly jumped back to 4/4, you're on the right track. But what he actually does is even smarter. 3 bars of even breakbeats, which again totals up to an uneven feeling 12/4 phrase. This is the best of both worlds. Now, the reason I chose the term rhythmic freedom is because this isn't just about time signatures, though it is curious that the first game barely had any odd time signatures at all. But even generally speaking, it seems like Bergeaud's approach to rhythm is so much more experimental this time. As it turns out, the thing that's holding him back might just be what made Ratchet & Clank 1's soundtrack so iconic in the first place. When looking for the right sound for the original Ratchet & Clank, Insomniac and Bergeaud settled on 3 major inspirations.
It's a cocktail. The retro sci-fi, early analog synthesis, of course, epic adventure, so the big orchestra, and we wanted it to be super cool and super hip while being retro and nostalgic. And so there comes in that third factor, which is more of the drum breaks, big electronic sound, the more contemporary at the time.
In the 2000s, contemporary inevitably meant it had to do with the genres of big beat, boom bap or jungle. Listening to the soundtrack, it's easy to hear the influence of the likes of Fatboy Slim or the Chemical Brothers, but ironically, I believe that's also where the biggest limitation stems from. It's the very foundation of those genres and by association the first Ratchet soundtrack. Breakbeats. In funk or jazz, you'd sometimes get sections where the whole band drops out and we get a drum solo, commonly referred to as a break, so a breakbeat. These moments are perfect for sampling since there's no instruments that get in the way. You do get James Brown moaning up your ear canal, though at this point even that is iconic. But you're somewhat limited to the performance that was captured on tape all those years ago, which 90% of the time means 4/4. This might explain why Ratchet 1 uses mostly straight time signatures. While it definitely makes for some catchy tracks, it also makes it difficult for Bergeaud to fully unfold his compositional potential. So for Ratchet 2, he sat down at a dinner table and said,
I don't think that we should be together. And I'm not gonna be able to spend as much time with you. And even when I do spend time with you, I'm gonna be thinking about drumming. And I'm gonna be thinking about jazz music and my charts and all that. And because of that, you're gonna start to resent me.
While I still stand by what I said about the Ratchet 1 soundtrack being a perfect fit, its style is so much dictated by the breakbeats that to me there was just not enough to merit calling it its own thing yet. That's especially true if you consider other games, movies or even toy commercials from that time. Sure, it's a deliberate choice, but still. In Ratchet 2, it's the composition that dictates the use of breakbeats, with plenty of tracks that seem to forego them altogether. Instead of being tied down, Bergeaud has assimilated the essence of breakbeats into his compositional arsenal. That's rhythmic freedom. And going from the OG to the sequel, he really just hits us with that rhythmic switcheroo right at the get-go. Aranos, the very first planet, our appetizer if you remember, is a perfect demonstration of this rhythmic freedom. As the track starts, we latch on to the pattern of the string part, suggesting a basic 4/4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Until it hits us.
Psych!
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's almost baiting the listener after coming from the first game and expecting something like... And while we're speaking of Aranos, I just got to point this out. When we later revisit the location against our will,
happy incarceration,
there's actually a different track that does the same thing in reverse. It's a bit hard to hear, but the intro suggests a 3/4 time signature. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But then the beat drops and we get a straight 4/4.
That's the wrong number!
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like, this perfectly mirrors the first level, and there's no way this is intentional, but it just shows how willing Bergeaud is to experiment with rhythm. I mean, or maybe it is intentional, I don't even know at this point. Now, to be fair, it's not like he got rid of the breakbeats entirely. Quite the opposite. See, that's where the MIDI drums I talked about in the beginning of this video come into play. Now that he's ditched the drum loops, he's free to program his own drum patterns as he wishes, using MIDI or by chopping up samples. So why not make your own breakbeat? There's a certain groove that people especially look for in breakbeats to sample. There's just something magical about this sequence, the first half establishing the accentuated beats, while the second part kinda goes funky with those syncopated snare hits. It's like a musical mullet.
Little business in the front and a little party in the back.
Slow it down and it's perfect for boom bap. Speed it up and you got jungle or drum and bass. But why stop there? As we've seen with Siberius, if you're, let's say, intelligent about it, you could change everything down to the time signature to your liking. Of course, nothing sounds quite like those classic recordings. But by once more taking just a small step back from the original formula and allowing himself to literally break apart this rhythm to fit his needs, Bergeaud has once again found the perfect way to keep the feel of the original without any of its limitations. And, well, just listen for yourself.
You're sweating.
But just like there's certain things you can't unsee, once you know about these breakbeats, you start noticing them everywhere, even in the tracks that don't at first appear to have them. No Tact, for example, has this mysterious, gloomy atmosphere to it, so going full breakbeat may be a little much. Instead, there's this percussive ticking sound which replaces the snare on 2 and 4. But due to the echo on that sound, it hits again in a timing that's reminiscent of the breakbeat snare pattern. Or take the track that plays while you use the Raritanium mining vehicle, which has an entirely different groove altogether. We have an upbeat, energetic, almost 4 on the floor pattern, but still there's this syncopated snare that adds an ever so slight hint of breakbeat to the song. In Damozel, instead of a drum kit, we actually get a bongo groove that imitates the breakbeat pattern. While we might not always get a full almond break, this twitchy, syncopated feel has still seeped into every hi-hat, bassline or percussion groove. Even in arguably the most non-Ratchet & Clank sounding track in this whole OST, Bergeaud ever so subtly hides that snare pattern in there. Like, it's not just me, right? Or have I finally lost it after all this time and I'm now hearing breakbeats everywhere I go? I need to sit down for a second. Sequels are tricky. There's an infamously narrow path between recapturing the original magic without retreading old ground. But there's also a second chance of sorts, an opportunity to return to an old idea with a fresh perspective. And if you manage to embrace what made the original work without being afraid to experiment, you might just end up creating something even better. Truth is, we never really left, we've just expanded. To me, this soundtrack hits the mark in a way that even surpasses the original. If you'd ask me to name a quintessential Ratchet & Clank track, one that encapsulates everything that you can expect from a classic Ratchet soundtrack, I'd have to skip right past the first game and pick something from this one. It's lightning in a bottle, just like the game itself. There's this almost rebellious confidence to it. It's comfortable but risky, familiar but foreign. It's... how can I put this? It's kinda like going Commando. Hey yo, what the fuck? Whoa. It's kinda dark here at the end of the video. And spacious. Isn't it weird how time flies? Last time we've been here was over 3 years ago, when we only just laid our hands on Rift Apart. I mean, we as in the community, not me. I still don't own a PS5. As I stated back then, I didn't know if this follow-up was even gonna happen. I made that first one because I kept hoping for a video on these soundtracks to pop up, but when it never did, I was like...
fine. I'll do it myself.
So fast forward, that video racked up over 200,000 views. I was not anticipating that kind of reaction. And what? There's actual meaningful discussions and genuine positivity happening in the comments? But I also didn't want people to hold their breath for a sequel anytime soon. I kid you not, I've seen my comment section go through the 5 stages of grief. Some have entirely given up on me making another video, as if I was laying on a deathbed. I really was trying to get this out sooner. I may have gone a bit overboard, and my bachelor's degree in procrastination sure didn't help, but the reality is that these analyses simply take an awful lot of time to make, and sadly I can't always put a passion project like this on top priority. But in an attempt to thank you all for being a truly wonderful audience, yeah, I could definitely see myself cooking up some more videos.
Yeah, boy.
Look, these soundtrack analyses will still be few and far between, so I think I'll toss in some other things here and there. Do let me know your thoughts and suggestions down below, that is always greatly appreciated. Okay, what else? Upload schedule? Never heard of her. So yeah, no gotcha this time. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you saw, go hit that subscribe button. And actually, do make sure to hit that bell so you'll know when my next video drops in, like, 2030. Help me.